Welcome to Gray Matter. I'm Michael Krasny, and it's a pleasure to be with you once again on Gray Matter, the podcast which features in-depth interviews with leading newsmakers, scholars, authors, and intellectuals in conversation with me, retired host for 28 consecutive years of the award-winning Forum program based in San Francisco. Also, it was heard weekdays on Sirius via National Public Radio. I'm also Professor Emeritus of Literature and author of a number of best-selling books, and my guest this week is a leading world expert on the world, Richard Haass, who, since 2003, has been president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He also served as director of policy planning for the U.S. State Department and as an advisor to President Bush I and Secretary of State General Colin Powell. His most recent book is The World, A Brief Introduction, and he's also the author of a number of other books, including The World in Disarray and Foreign Policy Begins at Home. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Haass to this week's edition of Gray Matter.
It's good to be with you, even though I assume gray matter refers not simply to what we have inside our skulls, but what we have on top of our skulls.
You're absolutely correct, except for the fact it also refers to the ambiguity of non-polarization and the name of, if you watch Breaking Bad, the name of the company that the leading character started out with and sold his interest for $5,000 to lose the billions that were there for him. So there's a lot of multiple meanings to gray matter. I want to begin, though, by posing a question to you that has been invading my consciousness when I think about geopolitics or world affairs, and I know few people who know them, know those areas as well as you do. The question has to do with what the biggest peril is now that faces us globally. And I'm talking about sovereign states primarily, because the world has really shifted with Ukraine and Russia, and it shifted in ways that were never anticipated, and particularly with respect to nuclear weaponry. So I want to go right to this in terms of what your assessment is. It used to be, well, we talked about the Middle East as the most volatile area, or the area with the most combustible or dangerous peril to it. India, Pakistan maybe in second place. But now Russia, with all the nuclear saber rattling, seems to be, as Mitt Romney once said, maybe in the lead again. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Where do we see right now the most peril?
Well, the first way I'd answer that, Michael, is that there's a long list. And you've got the revival of geopolitics, Russia definitely. You've got an unconstrained Vladimir Putin, who, if he wanted to use nuclear weapons, could probably do it. He's undone the institutions of Russia. So there's that. You've got China, which is increasingly confrontational and capable country out there. You've got the Irans, you've got the North Korea. So you've got any number of geopolitical actors in the queue. Secondly, you've got global perils, and I would put climate change first, but we've just come out of a pandemic that killed close to 20 million people worldwide. And then third, and perhaps most important, this part may surprise you, I would actually list the greatest peril facing the United States, not Russia, not China, not climate change, not COVID, but what's going on inside the United States. I think that the greatest peril to the functioning of this country are challenges to our democracy and challenges to the ability of our government to govern and to act. And the reason I think that's so basic is if we can't get that right, if we are increasingly divided or literally at war with ourselves here at home, there's no way on God's green earth we're going to be able to deal effectively or successfully with Russia or China or climate change or anything else. But if we do get it more right than wrong here at home, then at least we have a chance to deal successfully with these external threats.
What does that mean, getting it right here at home?
It means having a government that can function. It means not having wide scale or large scale domestic politically inspired violence. It means the ability to be somewhat reliable and predictable, because the gap between representatives of various parties is limited. So the rest of the world learns that our friends can depend on us for their security, and our foes have to respect us.
Well, I'm also concerned about the fact, though, that we're in a nuclear phase that we've never been in before. The fact is that Bill Clinton got Ukraine to pretty much remove their nuclear weapons, and some might argue that that meant no longer mutual assured destruction, and Putin gave him more carte blanche to do what he's done. But I'm also concerned about the fact that you've got the Saudis now pretty much in a kind of proxy war, almost in Yemen and other places with Iran, maybe wanting nuclear weapons, other countries wanting nuclear weapons, Iran obviously, but
Mhm.
and Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang advancing their nuclear weaponry. In other words, I'm concerned like you are about the United States, but we have all this volatility, and we also have China looking at Putin and saying, in effect, maybe we can do the same with Taiwan.
Maybe they are. And I think you're right to put your finger on the fact or the likelihood that we may well be entering what you would call a new nuclear age. Uh, I think you mentioned Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. It's been invaded twice since then. You've got 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons. A tenth, Iran would like to. Uh, China may well take from the Ukraine crisis that the growth of its own nuclear arsenal, something, by the way, they've accelerated, is desirable because it would introduce caution into how the United States might respond to a Taiwan crisis, just as it's introduced caution into how the United States has responded to Russian aggression in Ukraine. And it's quite possible that if the United States becomes less reliable or even more unreliable, that countries around North Korea and China will say, hey, we need our own nuclear weapons. And the same would hold, as you suggest, for countries in the neighborhood of Iran. So we could be very much on the brink of a new nuclear age where we go from 9 countries with nuclear weapons to 15 or so countries with nuclear weapons. And then you've got the danger of nuclear use, plus all the dangers of the transition from where we are now to then. So I think that's suddenly become a legitimate and real concern.
That's certainly a real concern when you simply look at things, even objectively, if that's possible. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as an old hand I shouldn't use that phrasing,
Okay.
as a veteran of, well, we talked about the grayness earlier, as a veteran of diplomacy and certainly trying to make the world a safer place. Diplomacy, sanctions, some might say limited efficacy, the same with maybe freezing assets. What can we do to bring about more cooperation, especially with a weak United Nations? What can we do, in your judgment, in other words, to bring greater trust and maybe even peace?
That's way too ambitious for me. I would define goals right now as much more modest, but still difficult. In the case of Russia, I'm not looking for peace or cooperation. I'm looking for Russia to stop invading its neighbors. And I think there, the best way to do it is through deterrence or defense, military capability, and then far more significant sanctions than we now have. I'm not wild in favor of the central bank assets being frozen. I think that's a dangerous step. But I do think that Europe needs to do much more to reduce its dependency on Russian natural gas. Right now, Russia is funding its war all too comfortably. So, I think there's a role for sanctions. I think sanctions alone can't do it. That's why you need, among other things, military force. But more broadly with Russia, I don't see much upside under this leadership. Under China, I think it's slightly more nuanced. But again, Xi Jinping's China is very different than previous China, say, of Deng Xiaoping. This is a far more capable, far more assertive, or even aggressive China. So again, I think the upside of cooperation is extraordinarily modest right now. I think foreign policy for the immediate future is more about what we can avoid than what we can bring about.
Talking to Richard Haass, who is head of the Council on Foreign Relations, what would you suggest needs to be done here other than having free, fair, and perhaps, if it's possible, completely transparent elections?
Here in the United States?
Yeah, since you mentioned this is maybe the greatest threat right now.
Well, that would be it. I mean, fair elections are about 2 things. One is in the run up to the elections and, through election day, that you have fair competition for who can run, have access to media and the rest. And then obviously that voters who want to vote and are eligible to vote can vote. There's that part. And then afterwards, you've got to have an accurate counting of the ballots. And I think there's questions on both ends. In the backdrop to elections, whether all those who want to vote have a chance to vote, that we have reasonable opportunities to vote in place. I'd like to bring about a country, but this is not a matter of law. It's a matter of culture and behavior, where more Americans did vote, took advantage of the opportunity. And then again, as we've seen with the January 6 hearings, there's got to be careful counting of the ballots. Americans can't lose faith in the integrity of the ballot box. Beyond that, there's much bigger questions about the working of our political system and so forth. And there's all sorts of potential reforms, but I think a lot of those are probably going to be beyond reach, simply because there's not a consensus on doing these things. And almost every reform you or I could think of would be seen accurately and not as advantaging one party or one individual and disadvantaging others. And not surprisingly, then it's very hard to get agreement on implementing reform.
Never been as polarized, though, and we have the extremes on the left and the right, perhaps unprecedented.
I agree, and this is the most divided I've seen the country. I read a bit of history, as do you, since the mid-19th century. We know what it led to then. I'm not predicting a second civil war, though I think the idea of widespread political violence has become all too imaginable. We narrowly escaped it after this past election in November 2020. January 6th was a taste of what we could experience. And I can imagine contested elections in the future, particularly if you had local officials who clearly tilted the playing field in favor of this or that candidate or party, and others would feel they had been disenfranchised and would take to the streets. Look, that's the danger in any democracy. If people lose faith in the system as being a place of fairness and opportunity, they will go outside the system. And we have got to be mindful. I think, to me, Michael, the real lesson of the last few years is that we've got to be cautious with our assumptions, things that you and I never talked about in the past. In all the years we've been having conversations, things that we never thought we'd have to worry about when we got up in the morning, now we have to worry about. And one of them is we can't take American democracy for granted. I'm not just thinking about it, I'm writing about it. My next book, so we can talk about it in 6 months. My next book, which comes out in January, it goes back to your first question. What's the biggest peril facing the United States? I've written a book about American democracy and how it's gotten to the point it has, and what do we need to do to protect it and preserve it and reform it. And I've written about that, even though I'm a foreign policy, national security guy, because I'm deeply worried about it.
We've got questions already coming in for you in this new podcast of ours, Gray Matter. We have questions that we're going to be interspersing throughout our conversation. This is from someone in Cape Town, South Africa, named Haass, who wants to know, says the African Union chair met Putin on Friday concerning food shortage in Africa worsened by Russia blocking Ukraine exports of grain. Africa is mostly marginalized in global affairs. Your thoughts?
Couple of thoughts. Africa doesn't have a large voice in international affairs. The African Union is modestly helpful dealing with certain governance issues, economic issues in Africa, but not more than that. The two most powerful countries in Africa, Nigeria and South Africa, don't have more than a regional footprint. I think the good news about Africa is it's unlike Europe or the Middle East or Asia. It's not overwhelmed by interstate problems between countries. The real issues are internal and governance. And I think the biggest issue for Africa over the next 20, 30, 40 years is going to be demography. It's the one part of the world that's going to experience fast growing demography. Africa is going to have an extra billion people over the next half century. And the question is, will there be the educational opportunity, the jobs, the medical systems, and the rest to give them the lives they need and deserve? And in the immediate question, side of the question dealing with the world food crisis, a lot of the countries who are going to most experience pressures from food because of what Russia has done will be in Africa. Just as an aside, Africa is also going to experience the lion's share of near-term problems because of climate change. It's going to increase dramatically the number of internally displaced people and refugees. The real question is whether the world is willing and able to act to get Russians to lift the blockade on Ukraine's ports. Ukraine is one of the principal shippers, exporters of grain and foodstuffs to the world. My guess is not in terms of Putin allowing it to happen. He'd only be open to it happening if we lifted sanctions against Russia. We're not going to do that for good reason. So the question is, can one way or another you get more grain out of Ukraine over land, say through Romania, and then they could ship it out? Or is the world willing and able to take action, for example, as some have suggested, to escort merchant ships and to dare the Russians to shoot merchant ships carrying grain to the rest of the world? I don't know if we're going to be prepared to do that. I don't know how the Russians would react, but it may come to that before this war is resolved.
And yet we're seeing in Ethiopia and Somalia, Nigeria, and one also has to include, of course, Yemen and Egypt, terrible food shortages because of what's going on in Ukraine, aren't we?
Absolutely. We're seeing two things. We're seeing food shortages and we're seeing price hikes. The price of food is going up dramatically. So the potential for this triggering political instability, famine, social disruption is great. There's no evidence that Mr. Putin cares one iota about any of this. I also think we've not been particularly effective, we, the United States, at rallying a lot of the world against Putin. I think we've talked way too much about democracy. We haven't talked enough about order and about the need to prevent countries from invading their neighbors. We haven't talked enough about world food. So it's possible we could put more pressure on the Russians. But again, I don't hold out a lot of hope for that. So I think the real issue is whether there is the willingness on the part of much of the world to come together to challenge the Russians over this. And it's dangerous if we do it. And quite honestly, it's dangerous if we don't do it. That's where we are.
Of course, some would argue that we're really in a kind of war with Russia right now, using drones and cybersecurity and other kinds of things as opposed to conventional warfare. It's a different kind of war, but it certainly could be at least labeled or signified as a kind of war. Where is the United Nations in all of this? Or, I mean, NATO has come together, the EU has come together in ways that nobody had anticipated, but
Sure.
United Nations, I realize that Russia's on the Security Council, but it
No.
seems almost, at this point, academic at best for how the United Nations could be involved.
United Nations is irrelevant here. It's feckless, it's sidelined. Anytime you have a great power with a veto involved as a protagonist in a crisis, and if another great power disagrees with it, the UN won't be able to do anything. The UN was never meant to be an institution or a vehicle to be used by one great power against another. It was meant to be a venue where they could talk. Obviously, the United States, Great Britain, and the United Kingdom and France are on one side, Russia, to a large extent, China on the other. So the Security Council, the operational arm of the UN, is hamstrung. It's gridlock, which is why we've taken things to NATO, just as we did, by the way, in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. When Russia vetoed things there, and the UN, then we did an end run. You do a workaround. So you're still multilateral. You just don't do it through the UN. This is just a cold fact of life, that the UN is sidelined when the major powers disagree.
Question from Kenneth, who's joined us from Seattle. He wants to know, is a cyber war with China more troublesome than that with Russia?
I don't think so. It's a good, at least not yet. It could be, but with Russia, over the years, Russia's been more aggressive in cyberspace in terms of, for example, interfering with American political processes. So the whole cyber issue has been less pronounced during the Ukraine crisis than I would have thought. And I'll be honest with you, Michael, I don't quite understand exactly what is going on or not going on and why. China's been active in cyberspace in such areas as espionage. If you remember, it got inside the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, got access to millions of records. In terms of the theft of intellectual property, something that China has done.
They're stealing far more
frequently.
of that than any other country in the world from the United
Absolutely.
States. Yeah.
Absolutely. And no, it's part of the argument about we let China into things like the World Trade Organization on the assumption that its behavior would moderate, that it would play the game by the rules. And instead they took advantage and exploited getting in and essentially cherry picked those things they wanted from being integrated into the world. If there ever is a crisis over Taiwan, I would think cyber could and would play a significant role, and that China would try to use cyber offenses early on in order to blind the United States, Taiwan, Japan, in order to interfere with our military actions. And I expect we would act in kind.
Again, we're talking with Richard Haass, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. And let me thank the listener from Seattle. And here's another listener and someone who's with us this morning. Joe Phillips wants to know, will the potential threat of economic downturn worldwide, with the potential threat, how do you see that affecting the United unified sanctions against Russia?
It's a good question, and I think it will make it more difficult. The sanctions have, among other things, contributed to inflation. We've seen it certainly in the energy sector. More broadly, it's yet another factor that's complicated supply chains and the movement of goods around the world. And you will have some pushback. We're already seeing it potentially in Europe. We could see it here. And so you have this combination of fatigue with the war fatigue, and then a certain degree of sanctions fatigue. And that worries me, that we will lose some of our willingness or ability to play the long game, and Russia will not. So I think that's a legitimate concern that caller expressed.
Let me ask you, though, about the world economy, since that listener brought up economic downturn, and we've been talking about problems with food. Inflation is higher here than it's been since the early 1980s, and for that matter, global prices and global disruption in food, oil, and so many goods going on, proliferating, not to mention COVID-19 and, for that matter, global warming. Are these patterns that can be turned around, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine, or at least can the problems be diminished, reduced? To what degree?
My own view is things are going to get worse before they get somewhat worse. In terms of recession, the idea that we could manufacture a soft landing, that we could navigate through the Federal Reserve System and through the administration and Congress a way of dampening down inflation without causing a recession, you'd have to be a real optimist to believe we could pull that off and bring about a so-called soft landing. I think the most likely thing is we have a recession. And if there's a recession here, as they used to say, if the United States sneezes, the rest of the world catches cold. I think we could also have a period of stagflation where you have low growth coupled with inflationary pressures. China, the growth numbers that people are now saying the real numbers are as low as they've been in decades, 1, 2, maybe at most 3%, probably, but probably closer to 1 or 2%. So I actually think this is going to be a very difficult period for the world economy. There was tremendous optimism coming out of the pandemic that you would have a lot of what you might call catch-up growth, and largely because we mismanaged the economy here. I think the United States and a lot of the rest of the world will pay something of a price for it, and the war has obviously played into it by increasing pressure on energy prices and other prices, so commodities and other things that have to move by sea.
Another question from South Africa. Outside of the reaction and mobilization against the Russian invasion, can you comment on Biden's foreign affairs foray to date? China, North Korea, Iran all seem to have relegated below the White House radar.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think for most Americans, when they get up in the morning, it's true that foreign policy is not their priority. They're much more concerned about inflation, the price of gasoline, the price of food. They're much more concerned about things like crime in our cities, which has gone up. Obviously, these mass killings in certain places like Texas, tremendous concern about the southern border. This week, you'll have all sorts of reactions to Supreme Court decisions, among other things, dealing with abortion in the United States, or access to abortion. So it's true that foreign policy is not at the top of the concerns of most Americans. So I think the administration is reacting to that. That said, they've had an active foreign policy, whether you agree with it or not, whether it's not just Ukraine, but vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Afghanistan, Iran. I think a lot of these areas I would take issue with. I disagreed with what we did and how we did it in Afghanistan. I wish our China policy had some other, shall we say, dimensions. to it. I don't think there's a strong case for trying to get back into the 2015 JCPOA with Iran. So we can go around the world. So but I think the most noticeable upside about the administration's foreign policy has been the reviving America's alliances in Europe and Asia and strengthening such certain new groupings like the Quad, the creation of AUKUS. Essentially, what we have in Europe is a revived NATO against Russia, and what we have in the Indo-Pacific, as it's now called, we have stronger alliances and stronger strategic partnerships. I think that's been the biggest upside of the administration's foreign policy. But again, I'm as critical as anybody about Afghanistan, about the lack of a trade policy, and I question the wisdom of what we're doing vis-a-vis Iran.
I share your concern about Afghanistan. I mean, the exit was a disaster and a debacle, but I'm also interested in what you see ahead vis-a-vis Afghanistan. There's some concern now, for example, about Taliban promises they didn't quite come through with women the way they said they would. And I don't know about Al-Qaeda either. I mean, are they going to bring Al-Qaeda back? We certainly can't trust them when they say no more trust with respect to how they comport themselves with women than how they comport themselves with respect to what I'm talking about here. That is the alliance that they've had in the past with Al-Qaeda.
Socially, you're exactly right in terms of the society they are bringing back, and their pledges haven't amounted to much, if anything. In terms of groups like Al-Qaeda, it's hard for me at times to know what's a question of will and what's a question of capability. And also when you speak about the Taliban, my own view is it's still a little bit hard to think about it as a single national unified entity. There's a lot of decentralization and, if you will, local factors. But I assume that whether it's out of a lack of will or a lack of capability, one way or another, groups like Al-Qaeda, other terrorist organizations will make real inroads into Afghanistan. I think that's part of the cost we will pay for what we did in our departure.
Well, is it foolish to say that we can be more sanguine about a number of the Hydra heads of ISIS having been cut off and decapitated, that they're certainly not as dangerous as they once were by any stretch?
These aren't so much organizations as they are networks, and they come back. So yes, you can make progress, but particularly, what we were talking about a few minutes ago, if you have food crises, if you have climate change, you're going to have a lot of governments around the world that are simply not going to have the capacity to police what goes on within their own territory. You'll have a lot of people who are desperate. And I would think that's a context in which these groups will make something of a comeback, be it in Afghanistan or parts of Africa and the Middle East.
Merrick Garland has gone over to try to bring some justice with respect to Russia and make the international court a place where war crimes will be tried. Just how likely is this to take place, and to what extent, in your judgment?
The United States has only limited standing, given our own views about the International Criminal Court. When it comes to what the Russians have done, I don't think that there can be any serious debate. They have committed war crimes, and they continue to commit them on a daily, if not hourly, basis. This is a brutally pursued war against civilians. For the most part, and that's what war crimes. Those are fundamental war crimes. I would simply say, though, our ability to hold Russia accountable is, we're not going to get at Putin or the inner circle. And I'd also say, as terrible as what they're doing, I would say my priority right now is to prevail in this war, and to deal with war crimes afterwards. My own sense is we want this war to stop. We want to stop on terms that Ukraine and ourselves can live with. So I would put, again, the assumption that there's war crimes. Unfortunately, that's the case, and they're going to continue. And the best thing we could do right now, I'd say, is try to figure out how to end the war sooner rather than later, to limit Russia's scope to commit even more war crimes. And then afterwards, we can deal with questions of accountability.
Well, Putin's been bragging about his nuclear weapons and just what he's capable of doing. How capable is he of using them, in your judgment? Or is that even predictable?
It's not predictable. It's not clear that it's knowable. But every person I've talked with about this, Michael, tells me that if Putin wanted to use nuclear weapons, he just might, certainly on a limited basis, be able to. And the analogy I always use, and when I talk to real Russian experts, and I don't claim to be one, they agree with me, is that Nikita Khrushchev, at the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, had much less freedom of maneuver, much less control or power than Vladimir Putin does today. Vladimir Putin has systematically deinstitutionalized Russia. He's hollowed out its institutions, and as a result, hollowed out its controls and constraints. So my concern is, if he wanted to use nuclear weapons, certainly on a limited basis, he might well be able to. We certainly can't assume that he would not, and that's one of the reasons that we do have to proceed with a bit of caution here.
Our guest is Richard Haass, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm Michael Krasny, and a question from the UK from Mansfield from Dennis, and thank you for the question, Dennis. Dennis wants to know, we're shifting to another area of the world, how would the UK's threat to break international law and the new Northern Ireland Protocol bill affect its standing beyond the EU?
Well, let me just say I'm no fan of Brexit. I thought it was, to use a British football analogy, an own goal. I never understood the rationale for it. And one of the casualties of it, I believe, ultimately could well be the United Kingdom. I believe this will increase centrifugal tendencies, certainly in Scotland, as well as Northern Ireland. I have strong views about Northern Ireland. I was the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace talks for 3 years. And then subsequently, I was an international mediator invited in by the parties that constitute the Northern Ireland executive. So I've got strong views about it. Britain made certain, the United Kingdom made certain commitments, and one was to honor the Good Friday agreement. You cannot create then de facto or de jure border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the idea that now the government wants to revisit that, I would say, is unacceptable. So, so I don't like what they're doing, locally. I don't like what, I don't like when governments go back on their international obligations. The whole process of getting peace in Northern Ireland was a hard, it was a hard fought effort. The Troubles claimed over 3,000 lives over the course of those few decades. And I believe that what the government is doing is simply unwise. I don't know where it's all going to lead, and there's interesting dynamics in Northern Ireland, some of which are brought about demographic. I think the irony of all this, Michael, is that Brexit may actually reinforce the push over time for Irish unification. Because if you're a young person, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or whatever, and you're in Northern Ireland, you want a future in Europe. And the only way then to have a future in Europe would be through Irish unification. So I believe one of the great ironies of what has happened here is that it may actually reinforce pressures over time, not immediately, but over time to bring that about. But in the short run, the government should honor its obligations. But you can't, more broadly on Brexit, they promised economic gains. Just the opposite. This has been an economic fiasco, and they promised that they would observe their commitments under the Good Friday Agreement, and now they want to go back on them. So I hope their feet are held to the fire here.
You want to say something about Boris Johnson and all of this?
I think I just did.
That's what I thought. Here's Eric from Washington, D.C. Eric wants to know, do you think a resurgent Russia will push the EU towards greater unity and cooperation, or will it be a nail in the EU's coffin, especially as NATO follows its own mandate?
It's a good question. I think the EU has taken on slightly greater political character, so a greater sense of purpose. So I don't think it'll be a nail in any coffin. I think more broadly, Europe has been galvanized by what's happened, and it's manifested itself nationally, say some of the decisions we've seen in places like Germany, the decision of Finland and Sweden to apply for NATO membership. I think it's galvanized NATO. I think it's galvanized the EU, and the EU is not spending most of its time thinking about Brexit anymore. It's talking about both European economic issues as well as Ukraine. But the EU is going to face other difficulties. The parliamentary elections in France make France a much more complicated member. And over time, some of the centrifugal tendencies in Europe are going to resurface. And I think a lot of them, to some extent, have been hidden because of the animosity towards Russia. So I think the future of Europe is still, shall we say, is still very much complicated.
Yeah, let's stay with that for a moment because I was going to ask you about France in the recent election. Marine Le Pen gained a number of seats, a significant number of seats, but so did the far left. And I was also thinking while you were talking about Sweden and Finland applying for NATO membership that it's being held up because of Erdogan in Turkey. And Erdogan, sees himself as a member in good standing of NATO, but to a great extent, Erdogan has proved a bigger thorn than was assumed, largely because of his attitude toward the PKK, toward the Kurd, what he considers the Kurdish terrorists, I imagine. But this is a real impediment.
Well, two things. In terms of France, it in some ways reminds me a little bit of what's going on in here and some of the other developed democracies. There's a greater degree of political polarization. And when one looks at the new parliament, it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Macron, for President Macron to govern, to put together a working parliamentary majority. It may change from issue to issue. It may be very difficult. And you have a populism or nationalism on both the left and right, which I believe will make it very hard to govern there. In terms of Turkey, Turkey may technically be an ally in good standing, but no one I know thinks of it as a partner in good standing. It's a member of NATO, but it's a burr in everybody's saddle, whatever image one wants to use. And for Erdogan, who's illiberal at home, who's preoccupied with Kurdish nationalism, which he sees as the greatest threat to Turkey. He got in bed for a while with the Russians when he bought the air defense system and so forth. He's a difficult ally. I think in the case of, if he continues to hold up Sweden and Finland, what I have said is that we should treat them as de facto members of NATO and let the Russians know that, and if the United States wants, we could give a unilateral pledge to them and essentially let the Russians know that if they were to use force against them, we would react as if they were members of NATO.
What about the argument, particularly with Finland, that they have benefited to a greater degree by their position of neutrality? They haven't disturbed the bear.
That was true then, but this is a very different Russia. This is not, as we talked about a few minutes ago, this is a very different Russia. This is not a collective leadership, institutionalized Soviet Union. This is a much more aggressive one-man band. And as a result, we're not talking about, in some ways, the Soviet Union, that sclerotic, predictable country that we knew for 7 or so decades, or for 4 decades of Cold War. This is a very dangerous Russia. That's, we've seen it use force brutally in Ukraine twice, in Georgia. We've seen it in Syria, in the Middle East. So if you're Finland, you basically say, what's worked for us in the past, we can't assume it's going to work now. We're going to take, we're willing to reconsider our trajectory. And I actually think that's, understandable. You could add that it's one of the ironies of what Putin has done. Then what he's done is he's brought about these kind of sea changes in the outlook of several countries, and in the process, he's actually worsened Russia's strategic position. But there you have it.
This is Gray Matter, and our guest is Richard Haass, who is head of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003. And here's Frank Billings from Tucson, who says, as we watch the conflict in Ukraine, what should the U.S. and the world do today to avoid military conflict over Taiwan?
It's a good question. One is to do well in Ukraine. The worst possible lesson we could teach China is that aggression pays. So that would mean at a minimum continuing, or even more amping up, our military support of Ukraine, and to impose ever more draconian sanctions on Russia. And the big sanction that's sitting out there is obviously those dealing with natural gas. So one is to have a demonstration effect. So when the Chinese have conversations about what are the lessons, what are the takeaways from the Ukraine crisis, I don't want anyone in Beijing to be able to say, well, the lesson we learned is you can get away with this. So that's one thing. Second of all, I've argued in our magazine, Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, that we ought to be explicit, adopt a position of strategic clarity, saying we would go to defense of Taiwan if China ever attacked it, acted coercively against it. We've got to build up our military capability in the region. Taiwan itself has to do a lot more, spend more on defense, increase national service. Japan and other countries need to do more. We also need to look at our economic relations with China. And we need to, I think, restructure them so that if push ever came to shove, we would be in a position to sanction China rather than China be able to use economic leverage against us. So I think we've got a long ways to go if we're going to deter a Chinese use of force against Taiwan. And the reason I think this is so important, Michael, is I believe China is deadly serious about potentially doing this, conceivably well within the next decade. And if they got away with it, it would be a true historical game changer. Every country in that part of the world would reconsider its security, and they'd either deter or defer to China, appease China if they felt that we weren't reliable, or if they'd, among other things, develop nuclear weapons. The Japanese and others would reconsider their strategic posture. And this has been the most successful, most peaceful, for the most part, economically successful part of the world for decades. And if we wanted to change that, the best way to, or the worst way to change that would be by allowing China to use force against Taiwan and succeed. So I think there's things we've got to do in Ukraine, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, and there's things we've got to do locally. But when I look out over the next decade or so, which is Xi Jinping's likely tenure in China, I think this is the risk of this happening is not negligible.
And what about the risk with respect to China and the South China Sea? I mean, there is real danger there too, isn't there?
There's some. It's not the same. That yes, they've been militarizing the South China Seas. I think there we just continue to assert our navigational rights, and there's the danger of an incident more than anything. But that I'm less worried about because it doesn't have the same psychological or nationalist nature that Taiwan does, which really is the unfinished business of the Chinese Civil War. So I'm worried about the South China Sea, and that's why I think it's important. We challenge Chinese claims. We have hotlines and all that to deal with incidents. But if you ask me to choose the issue, which I think is the greatest potential to bring the United States and China to conflict, it would be Taiwan.
Again, my guest is Richard Haass, and wondering what your, just to shift to another part of the world for the moment, what your thoughts are about recent changes, at least shifts in Central American countries. We still have the dictatorships throughout Central America, Nicaragua, down into South America, Venezuela, and so forth. But also had some interesting things occurring, at least from my perspective. An election in Chile of someone who's certainly deemed more to the left, or for that matter, more recently in Colombia.
Yeah.
With Gustavo Petro, who is definitely more to the left. So are we seeing things changing to some degree, or how do you speculate?
The short answer is yes. And again, there's some parallels here, but what we're seeing the center get weaker. And we're seeing extreme left or extreme right. In Brazil, you've had more on the right, but the coming election this fall in Brazil is between a rightist and a leftist. We just had that parallel in Colombia. You had the election, as you say, in Chile. We had Mexico a few years ago in the election of López Obrador. So we're seeing populism come to the fore in Latin America. That always, happens traditionally in difficult economic times. The interesting thing is the last few years have been, better economic times than usual. Yet it's still happened. But no, it's worrisome. Latin America, it looked like it had escaped in some ways this pattern historically. It looked like democracies were getting more, institutionalized. And we'll see. I think this is going to be a real test for democracy, for governance in a lot of these countries. But these kinds of wild swings from far left to far right, these kinds of choices are not healthy. And Colombia, for example, you had the tremendous progress that was realized after more than a decade of conflict internally. And I hope that ground isn't lost. And I hope the society doesn't come apart over this. Again, I'm not predicting that it will. But when you look at this part of the world, almost what I said about Africa, the biggest challenges in Latin America are not the kinds of challenges we deal with in places like Europe or Asia. There's no great power presence. We're not worried about countries invading. I'm not worried about Brazil invading Argentina. That's not the issue. The question in this part of the world is governance. Can these countries, can these governments manage their economies? Can they provide security in every sense of the word for their people? Can you build social consensus to make difficult choices? And I worry about that for big parts of Latin America now.
What about concerns with respect to the Middle East? We're going to see Benjamin Netanyahu come back to power now that Israel has essentially, well, the present government, which is a coalition government, has, well, we've got another election coming up.
Indeed, we have another election coming up, and I expect it'll be a close run thing. There's got to be election fatigue in Israel. No one ever gets a majority. Every single government in the history of the state of Israel has been a coalition. So you'll have an election, no party will get a majority, and then you'll have the bargaining that starts. And whether you can cobble together, and Benjamin Netanyahu will be in the middle of it. So I can't, at this point, I can't give you odds, but could he be the next prime minister of Israel? Yes, sir. That's a real possibility.
And let's talk about the Middle East for a while because things have shifted there too. You've got alignments now between Israel and Arab nations that never would have been anticipated. You've got the Saudis very concerned about Iran. The same is true, I think, of Egypt and really throughout a lot of the Middle East. Seeing Iran and Yemen, for example, what they're doing with proxies in Lebanon and so forth. The sands are shifting, and they're shifting in ways that just a number of years ago never could have been predicted.
You're exactly right. You and I are. This is gray. Gray is the word of the day. So you and I are of a generation where so much of the Middle East revolved around the fault line between Israel and the Arabs, or Israel and the Palestinians, and that's been the case since 1948. Obviously, the '67 war and so forth. Then for a while, you had the fault line revolving around Iraq. And whether it was the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait 30 plus years ago, then the 2003 Iraq war. Well, now we're in another phase. And I would say the principal fault line of the region now is Iran. And you've got Iran with its groups like Hezbollah, its influence in Syria, its influence in Lebanon, its influence to some extent in Iraq. But on the other side, you have some strange bedfellows. And you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got the UAE, you've got Bahrain, and yes, you've got Israel. And so that's where we are. This is now increasingly the fault line of the Middle East. And hopes that the Iranian government would somehow fall or evolve are not going to happen. It's entrenched for the foreseeable future and then some. They've moved pretty close to the precipice of getting the prerequisites in place of nuclear weapons. I don't hold out a lot of hope for diplomacy. So the question is now, what happens next? Do the Israelis and others continue to use force, targeted assassinations, software, and the rest to try to slow down the Iranian nuclear program? There's then what you do about the missile program. And then you still got groups like, again, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. So when I look at this, it suggests to me that the Middle East is going to continue to be unstable. It's going to continue to be turbulent. And I think the slight difference now is this question of the Iranian nuclear program has probably come to a head. And I understand the temptations to attack it, and those temptations may be irresistible. But Iran also has at its disposal lots of ways of responding. And I don't mean in the nuclear realm, but with shooting thousands of rockets into Israel against densely populated civilian areas and so forth. So just when you thought the Middle East couldn't come to the fore again and get worse, the potential is that it could.
And where do you see the Palestinians in all of this, particularly with respect to Abbas? Talk about grayness. I mean...
In every sense of the word, both age and politically being uninspired. I don't think anything happens for now. The Palestinians in the West Bank have terrible leadership, unaccountable, no elections, and the rest. You've got the divisions in the Palestinian world between Gaza, where you have Hamas, and the West Bank. Then in Israel, this election, the new election, won't produce a government that is based upon anything to negotiate. Indeed, it would probably be based upon not negotiating these issues. These issues are simply too divisive. So I don't see any movement right now at all going on. So I think this issue just stays frozen.
And what about the role of the Saudis? President Biden is going to be visiting Saudi Arabia, even though he essentially excoriated them, particularly for the Khashoggi assassination and for other
Mhm.
things that, at this point, in fact, it seems like the leadership of Saudi Arabia really, if anything, has become closer than ever to the United States because of the reliance now on oil with what's going on in Ukraine. Or at least the United States has become more dependent on the Saudis.
We're not dependent on the Saudis for our own energy situation, but obviously the world and U.S. prices are influenced by them. Look, the president, as a candidate Biden talked about the Saudis being pariahs, the crown prince in particular. But several things have come together that the administration was forced or is being forced to revisit it. One, as you say, is the whole energy situation. Second is the Iran nuclear program. Third is the Saudis a few months ago introduced a ceasefire into the war in Yemen from their side. You've got the possibility of some type of a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So for lots of reasons, the president and the administration have come around to a more realistic point of view. There's no way you can ignore Saudi Arabia or should for the next 50 years, which it could be conceivably the tenure of this crown prince when he becomes king, over the awful thing he did, which is not to say it wasn't awful or horrific, approving or ordering the assassination of Mr. Khashoggi, of Jamal Khashoggi. But so the question is, what kind of reforms can you get going forward in Saudi Arabia? Not simply so it does anything like this doesn't remotely happen again, but there could be other positive reforms. And what other types of cooperation can you kindle vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Israel, what have you? So I think that's where we are. It's not a pure foreign policy, but foreign policy isn't pure. It's a realistic one. I think we've also got to take into account that the crown prince is popular in Saudi Arabia. And again, he's likely to be there for decades to come. So the question is, how do we learn to work with him, flaws and all?
It's again kind of the divide between morality and pragmatism, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think a successful foreign policy has to have elements of both. But if you push me, I would say pragmatism and interests have to take precedence over preferences. Sorry, but that's what I think we have to do.
Well, here's Chris Clark from Phoenix, Arizona, who has a question about Pope Francis and a moral authority. He's in physical decline. His moral authority and credibility in terms of mediating is perhaps in decline as well. Are there any other potential mediators on the horizon, or is the mediation model obsolete?
The Pope has hurt himself in this crisis by some of his statements, which seem to me to be somewhat unfortunate in terms of how he's characterized things. As someone I've been a mediator many times, unsuccessful, I should add. I was the U.S. envoy to the Cyprus negotiations. As I mentioned before, Northern Ireland. I was heavily involved in Middle East peace talks. I was at the Madrid Peace Conference. I've been involved with India and Pakistan. So I know something about mediation. My own view is that mediators are exaggerated in their significance, and that at most they provide a missing, the last couple of percent of a deal, but the first 98% of the prerequisites for making a situation ripe, RIPE, come from the situation on the ground or from the protagonists. And in the case, say, of a Ukraine, in order for a mediator to be successful, it would not reflect the brilliance of the mediator. It would reflect a situation that both countries had concluded that continuing the war made no sense militarily, and that they would be better off accepting the sort of compromises they knew they would have to accept than they would continuing the war. In that kind of a context, even a mediocre mediator could do okay. But absent that kind of a context, no matter how brilliant the mediator, he or she could not succeed. So what really matters, again, are the basics, politically and militarily and economically, rather than the skill set of the mediator.
And here's Joe Phillips from Murphy, North Carolina, who wants to know about Turkish President Erdogan welcoming the Saudi Crown Prince with full military honors today. Does this signal reinvestment of the UAE back into Turkey and efforts to further expand their influence in the area?
Yeah, that was interesting. Noticing also the visit, this rapprochement. There'd been a lot of disagreements over Syria and other places. So again, this might have something to do with Iran. That and also a sense that this is emerging as the greatest threat to the region. There also could be some economic uh, concerns, also some concerns about Russia. So I see this as in some ways emblematic of a new chapter that both Turkey and Saudi Arabia decided to turn the page. And what exactly they will do together, I'm not sure. But again, it was this was notable. Yes.
It's especially logical when you think that both Turkey and Saudi Arabia are Sunni nations or led by Sunni Muslims as opposed to Iran, which is a Shiite nation.
There is that, and obviously both are concerned about Iran's influence through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and both Saudi Arabia and Turkey have their own ambitions in the region, shall we say? So I'm not sure at the end of the day if they're natural partners, but the old adage that the enemy of your enemy is your friend, there might be a little bit of that at work here, even if it's temporary.
Again, our guest is Richard Haass, and Richard Haass is since 2003. Again, I apologize for demoting you, taking 4 years away earlier in the introduction. Don't know how that happened, but I did.
It's all right.
Head of the Council
Worse
on
things
Foreign
have been said.
Relations.
Much worse has been said about me, Michael.
Yeah, well, likewise. But we've got just a few minutes left, and I'm wondering what we can be sanguine about or what we can be hopeful about. And when we look at the global conditions, there's been a lot of emphasis this hour with you, as there always is, on just the world being a sudden and frightful place and full of peril. We've got all these nuclear concerns and concerns with the economy and everything. What do you see on the brighter side? Where's the light?
Yeah, I am a little bit of Debbie Downer, and I apologize. Look, one is, with COVID, I'd say the impact of technology there, the fact that these extraordinary vaccines came along, and even though millions of people died, think, one, a lot of that wasn't inevitable, but two, think about how much worse it could and would have been had it not been for these vaccines, which also strengthen us against potentially against future viral outbreaks. I think that's an impressive thing. My sense is, the economic problems we're facing will be cyclical and temporary. So that in and of itself doesn't work. That doesn't bother me particularly much. On climate, again, there could be some technological breakthroughs that could help us, whether it's things with batteries or a new generation of nuclear power plants. It comes down then to political will. I like the fact that both in Europe and Asia, you're seeing alliances and partnerships be much more robust than they were only a year ago. I mean, if we had had this conversation 6 months or a year ago, Michael, would have been inconceivable to imagine the strengthening of NATO, Finland, and Sweden wanting to get in, the Germans doing what they're doing. So I think, Putin in that sense has done, amidst all the awfulness, has done us something of a favor. So I see some good things out there. History is always a competition or a balance between forces of order and disorder. So you're right. I see more on the potentially on the negative side of the ledger, and a lot will hinge on what happens in Ukraine. That we show. I think it's really important that we show that aggression doesn't pay. That militarily it can't succeed. Economically, Russia will pay a price. I think that would influence Chinese calculations not to use force against Taiwan. And, somewhere in the next decade, you're going to have transitions probably in both Russia and China. And I'm hoping that the future leaders of those countries take a lesson from the pariah status that Mr. Putin has given Russia, from how China has created far more enemies on its borders than it used to have. So I don't assume that the current disposition of China and Russia is somehow locked in permanently. So we'll see how things play out. There's very little about history going forward that's inevitable. So I actually think there's no reason. There's reasons to be concerned, but not reasons to be immobilized or feel that bad things are somehow baked into the cake.
Well, as a serious student of international relations, I've always believed that you really can't tell where things are going to go, just like human affairs in general. Even on the personal level, let alone the state and national levels, things can occur that just surprise and completely take us kind of on the blind side. Just a quick question, since you mentioned Germany, there's been some criticism about the new leadership. On the one hand, they seem to be extending more toward helping with Ukraine, but now they've come under some fire for not helping enough.
You're right. There's glass half full, glass half empty. They've come farther than I've ever thought they would have in a short amount of time, but they now seem overly concerned about not alienating Russia, not doing too much for Ukraine, and not doing nearly enough on the energy front. They continue to close nuclear plants. They're now, doing more with coal. I don't see them doing enough to roll back their dependence on natural gas. So yes, it's equal parts encouraging and disappointing what we're seeing.
Well, on that note, let me say it's always a delight to talk to you, to get your wisdom and get your perspective, which is broad and extraordinary in so many ways. And we will talk again. Always enjoy talking to you.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you in your new vintage here
Well, it is.
with gray matter.
It is a new vintage, and we're very hopeful about it and excited about it. Richard
Good.
Haass, again, is head of the Council on Foreign Relations and has been since 2003. Conclude with perfect symmetry there from where I began.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Richard.